Welcome to the African News Review podcast, where we cut through the noise and get to the truth. I am your host, Adesoji Iginla, and each week we are here to challenge the biases, prejudices, and misinformation in the Western press about Africa. Using historical context and contemporary insights, we set the record straight and reclaim the narrative. Tune in every Sunday at 12 p.m. Eastern as we uncover the real stories and reshape the conversations about Africa. This is the African News Review podcast, reclaiming Africa's narrative, one story at a time. Good day, everyone, and welcome again to another in our series of African News Review. And with me, my name, Adesoji Iginla, and with me, as usual, is our in-house analyst, an expert in itself, and an author, an explorer, a publisher, Black Star News. I give you none other than Comrade Milton Allimadi.
Thank you, my brother, as always.
And yes, this week has been very, very interesting, not the least on your side of the world, where the idea of fallen heroes have become a hot potato issue, in the sense that people are now using them for campaigning, and the pushback has been, let me say, less than cordial. And it makes sad and grim reading that this is what we've come down to. Your initial assessment on that?
Yeah, of course, because first of all, this candidate, former President Trump, is a very nasty person. Remember what he said about the late Senator McCain.
Yes.
Obviously, McCain, a Republican senator, I didn't really share much or agree with many of his views. But at one time, he was a soldier in the U.S. Army. He fought in Vietnam. His plane was shot down.
Yeah.
He was captured. He was tortured. Obviously, that was a war of imperialism. So, of course, I oppose that war in itself. But that's not what I'm discussing now. I'm discussing
his humanity.
The fact that he was captured and tortured. And then you have Trump. When Trump was running for the first time, said McCain is not his hero because his heroes are soldiers who are not captured.
Yes.
About that.
Yes.
And now this same guy is posing for photographs at a national cemetery.
Next to a
mostly
headstone.
for soldiers to use it for his campaign.
Yeah, next to a headstone, which is
It does not get any more nasty than that. That's why I call him a nasty human being.
Well, coming back home, by that I mean going back to the continent.
Yes.
We've been in the news, and as usual with the Western slant. And so for our first story, we go to the Financial Times, which seems to have an issue with, kid you not, the so-called middle powers. Okay, so our first story comes from the Financial Times, and it's titled "The Middle Power Competition in Africa. The jostle for influence brings opportunity but also scope for bad decisions." It's written by the editorial board. And so we take it this is the position of the mouthpiece for capital.
Right.
It starts, Africa has rarely been at the top of the world agenda. But in spite of its lack of obvious economic or strategic clout, many African nations are being courted by countries as varied as Turkey, Brazil, and Russia. The interest of such middle powers reflected in sprouting Turkish embassies, swanky African summits, and high-profile visits presents African leaders with greater choices on investment and strategic partners. As a Financial Times series has reported, this pick and mix world creates opportunity that, if cleverly exploited, helps countries break free of poverty. This will strike better deals on vital infrastructural projects or insist that commodity deals be accompanied by domestic processing of raw materials. I'll stop there. Okay. Why do you think all of a sudden they're a bit interested in Africa's well-being? By that, I mean the money of capital. Because if you follow that line there, they will strike better deal on vital infrastructural projects or insist that commodity deals be accompanied by domestic processing of raw material.
Right. So everything except the first sentence is actually correct. It's correct, but it's not complete.
Okay.
Africa has never been on top of the global agenda. That, of course, is a complete lie. Africa has always been number one on the global agenda. And that is what led to enslavement of millions of Africans.
Colonialism.
That's what led for colonialism. And that's why neocolonialism persists. And that is why we still have institutions like the World Bank, IMF, and the World Trade Organization to keep Africa impoverished so that the former colonial powers, primarily Britain, France, Belgium, and the new global power, the United States, can continue to exploit Africa the way Africa has been exploited for centuries. So that is a complete lie. And of course, the first lie followed by that it has a lack of obvious economic clout, which, the irony is that the rest of the article goes on to contradict that second sentence. And the rest of the article is spent on showing Africa's economic clout.
Exactly.
So, I don't know whether the editor slept upside down on his bed or her bed or hit their head when they woke up. I have no idea.
Okay.
Yeah. But I think the article actually, essentially, 90 or 95% of it is correct. It just leaves out one crucial element, which is industrialization. Industrialization is not going to be brought by trying to be clever, trying to get more for your raw materials, trying to get more of the processing of the materials done in African countries.
Yep.
Industrialization is a national concerted policy. And the Financial Times knows it. That's how Britain became industrialized, how the United States became industrialized. That's how the United States still maintains its advantage. On one side of the mouth, they talk about a free trade. The other side, they talk about tariffs all the time. They're always on a tariff war, particularly with China, of course.
China,
yeah, because they don't so much mind Europeans benefiting and growing their economies. They're worried about China because Chinese are not Europeans. So their racism
permeates.
Yeah, it becomes paramount when dealing with China. When dealing in Africa, it's still a sense of paternalism because these countries remain small, divided, balkanized countries. They would take Africa very seriously if African countries started practicing what Nkrumah preached in neocolonialism, the last stage of
imperialism. Yeah.
Which, of course, could be a Bible of African liberation.
Oh my God.
There you go. It is the blueprint, in fact, that led to the formation of the African Free Trade Continental Agreement. If you read Nkrumah's book and you read the agreement, you'll see that it's just an elaboration of Nkrumah's book.
Just taking a quick break here on the African News Review podcast, but don't go anywhere. If you're enjoying our deep dive into the real stories behind the headlines, make sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Every Sunday at 12 p.m. Eastern, we're here to debunk the myths and bring you the truth about Africa. Want to help spread the word? Share this podcast with your friends and leave us a review. It goes a long way in helping others discover the real Africa. Without further ado, let's get back to setting the record straight.
Yeah. There is also a part that stood out to me there, which is you could strike better deals on vital infrastructural projects and insist that commodity be accompanied by domestic processing of raw materials.
Yes.
When you speak of paternalism, I want to read from The Future That Works, selected writing by A.M. Badu.
Yes. Babu was another version of Walter Rodney, and of course that's the reason why he wrote the postscript to Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa.
Okay, so I'm taking a part from an open letter he wrote to Prime Minister Mugabe in the New African on May 2nd, 1980. He says, and I'll just read the poignant part here. The enemies of Africa are anxious to prove that every new African country is doomed to failure. To ensure this does not take place, they will want to entangle you deeply in their world system, so to destroy you. Proof? Look at what is happening in practically all sister countries: economic chaos, shortage of food, other basic necessities, corruption, and so on is the order of the day. You as a revolutionary will be a special target, particularly because of Zimbabwe's proximity to South Africa. And I'll end with the last bit here. Unlike many developing countries, you're taking over a country with considerable potential.
Yes.
Let me give you some comparable statistics. Kenya, a fairly prosperous, it proves prosperous in inverted commas, has double the population of Zimbabwe, 14 million to your 7 million as at then, and yet its gross national product is only 2.9 billion, compared to your 3.5 billion. That is the 1976 World Bank figures, or a percentage capital income of 220 to your $550. Incidentally, when the bourgeoisie took over France in 1792, the country per capita income was just over 500. Zimbabwe has a fairly solid industrial base, most of which was made possible thanks to the sanctions, which forced the country to look inward. It was what you might call a blessing in disguise. Looking back, one wishes that sanction had been imposed on all African countries soon after independence.
I agree with that assessment totally, because it would have forced them to do exactly what he's saying, what the racist apartheid regime in what was then called Rhodesia had to do, which was to really look within itself to produce, which is what South Africa had done during the era of colonialism and then apartheid colonialism, which lasted until the first free election in 1994. You see? So I agree with that assessment totally. And actually, Mugabe actually listened to his advice for a long time, because part of the advice was that don't be too quick to nationalize the land. Do it gradually. Make sure that Africans gain incremental expertise. Then, of course, the money promised never came. And that's why, it's so funny, because Mugabe initially was criticized by revolutionaries.
Yeah.
It's not going all the way, right? And then when he went radical and nationalized the land and took the land that had been stolen by the Europeans and gave it back to Africans, again, he was criticized for destroying
the economy.
So he was in a no-win situation.
And for those who want to know which book I quoted from, it's The Future That Works by A.M. Badu.
And of course, Babu was a former minister in Tanzania, a minister of economic planning.
Yes.
Then had a falling out with Julius Nyerere.
Yes.
So he was considered by the West to be too radical. In fact, they put pressure on Nyerere to get rid of Babu.
Yes, and putting question of pressures to get rid of someone, we go to Gabon for our next story, which is the issue of the palatable coup as we will put it.
Right.
Gabon moves towards, and this comes from the Deutsche Welle. This is the German
Correct.
outreach organization in Africa, the press
Okay, so
organization.
now that you put it in that context, before you proceed,
Yes.
and I like that we are constantly critiquing the media of those that want to dominate Africa. At the same time, it would be good if we had a global African media that we could compare and say, look at how, global Africa covered the same news.
Yeah.
And that is also in itself a sad statement. But until we have that, we will continue critiquing them without being able to compare them with how
we would have
it's being
reported
covered
said,
elsewhere.
yeah.
Correct.
Okay. So I go back.
Right.
It's been 1 year. So titled, it's headed up, Gabon moves towards democracy 1 year after coup. It has been 1 year since Gabon's military ousted the authoritarian President Ali Bongo. Keyword. The new junta has promised a swift return to constitutional order, sparking hope that the worst was behind it. But is it? Francophone Africa has experienced a series of coups since 2020, in Mali twice, followed by Guinea, Burkina Faso, Niger, and finally Gabon. The coups raised concern about the stability and democracy in the region. In an interview with Deutsche Welle, Ngo Badore from the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, affiliated with the German opposition party, the Christian Democratic Union of Germany, explained that while in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, duly elected presidents were ousted from power by power-hungry military leaders, taking advantage of a general sense of insecurity. The military government in Gabon appear to have ousted a autocratic despot. Let's hold on there first. That is a big lie. And the reason why I say that was a lie was when Omar Bongo was ousted, they had just recently completed the presidential election. So, how is it that on one hand, you can condemn the military government in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, and on the other hand, appear to give the autocratic government in Gabon a pass? I wonder what they all have in common that Gabon doesn't have, or what Gabon has that the rest of them don't have.
Well, this was their coup, and
Yes.
the article exposes itself when it says that this guy, Nguema, the interim military ruler, was hosted at the LSA Palace in Paris by President Emmanuel
Macron.
So that itself, just exposes the story. This is a French manufactured coup d'etat against a despot who had become inconvenient, a despot who might have invited a much more radical coup d'etat. So the coup d'etat was meant to preempt a coup d'etat similar to Faso's, to Mali's, and to Niger, where with what's common among those countries is to push out French influence and to invite Russian influence, which of course, I personally oppose. But given the lack of military capacity, lack of production of weapons themselves, they see Russia as a less imperial intervention than France. So in order to preempt something like that happening in Gabon, And as I said, this particular coup, I think, was an intermediate coup. There's no assurance that there will not be a much more radical coup d'etat in Gabon. And France is trying to prevent that. First of all, the headline itself is a lie. Gabon moves towards democracy 1 year after coup. The implication is that elections translates automatically into democracy, which of course is a complete fallacy. And that has been demonstrated in Gabon itself, many times, right?
Yeah.
There are encouraging elements in the story. There are encouraging elements in the sense that they talk about coming to an agreement that there should be presidential term limits, 2 term limits of 7 years, which is fine. But to me, the focus in all of these countries need to be on what they need to do to transform their economies. Ultimately, at the end of the day, it is whether you're able to produce and to feed your people that is going to determine the longevity of the structure. I'm sure the people in Burkina Faso, when Thomas Sankara came to power, I'm sure they had been acclimatized, they've been socialized in their minds. Democracy translates into elections, and preferably you have term limits, and preferably this is carried out so you have a transition, from power, one group to another, one individual to another individual. But Sankara was also able to demonstrate, and of course they did not have that in Burkina Faso, which was Upper Volta. But what Sankara was able to do was to show that there, in fact, is a much more important conversation that African countries need to have, which is, to what extent do ordinary people participate in the political process, number one? To what extent do they participate in production? And of course, our countries are not industrialized.
Sure.
So production is going to be agricultural, right? And in Burkina Faso, you had all these feudal land holdings. And imagine, it was that French which was actually blocking the country to become self-sufficient in food. So Sankara ended that, and within 3 years, think about it, the country was self-sufficient in food.
Food production.
So now, if you ask me to pick my choice of definition of democracy, would I pick Sankara's making Burkina Faso, the Burkinabe, participate and produce enough to feed themselves, or the people of Gabon going to vote in some election in a couple of months? Which one would I pick? Of course, I would pick what Sankara did for Burkina Faso. So we have to be very careful. Let's not fall into that trap when they keep talking democracy. What do they really mean? Are we satisfied that we have elections, we have regular transition? Is that sufficient? No. If there's no production and we keep maintaining neo-colonialism, I would rather go with Sankara's model anytime.
And I think what this article also is careful to hide is also the underlying intent behind the coup, like you were speaking to earlier, it was not so much as a radical element, but actually the fear of some of their own international partners coming in, because Omar Bongo had been moving towards the Americans. And here is a country that is rich.
His son,
Ali Bongo, sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Who had been moving towards the Americans.
Yes.
And you're talking about a country with oil reserves and gas.
Right.
If the French were to lose that, that's curtains for them.
Right. And they may still lose it anyway.
True.
Because the pressure is now regional. You cannot be a sanction. You cannot be, you cannot really be this one outpost of neocolonialism when all your regional partners are moving in a different direction.
Exactly.
It would be very difficult to survive.
Exactly.
It would be like you wanting to be apartheid in what was Rhodesia, well, every African country around you is being liberated, or apartheid in South Africa. You see, it is completely incongruous. So the French are really trying to block the leak in the dam with a finger.
With a finger, Spartan. So I would, there's a part here that stood out to me. 50 years of Bongo's dynasty. For over half a century, the Bongo family used authoritarian methods to cling to power in the resource-rich Gabon. Omar Bongo was president from 1967 until he died in 2009. His 41 years in office was one of the longest of any head of state in Africa, and he was succeeded in office by his son Ali Bongo. The Bongo clan long reign and autocratic rule led to widespread dissatisfaction. Now, there is one part here that is kind of painful to read. Okay, on 26th of August 2023, Gabon held another election. Official results certified a clear victory for Bongo, which was hoping to extend the family rule to 55 years. Hardly anyone in the country considered the results credible. 4 years later, he was toppled, by his cousin. Now, the part that stood out to me there is, this is, like you said, an in-house coup, because he was toppled by his cousin. So what's to argue against the fact that it is the Bongo rule continuing, but under a different franchise?
Correct. And that's exactly what it is. And they made that to dupe readers whose eyes are not yet, open. They dupe them by leaving out in the parts that you read, the one paragraph and then another sentence. When they say he was there for 41 years, authoritarian or autocratic or what have you, they left out 3 very critical sentences, which is with the support of France. So it's amazing how, completely disingenuous. And obviously, I mean, I respect Deutsche Welle. I do, but not in this particular article. That was a very glaring omission, which goes back to what you suggested in the beginning, which is, of course, is to push this agenda that this is more or less a noble coup d'etat compared to the one in Guinea, the one in Mali, and the one in Niger. Was Bongo surviving by himself? Who was buying the oil and gas from Bongo? Who was training his armed forces? Who had troops stationed in Gabon? Who was giving him the weapon?
It would be interesting.
Mind-boggling. We are supposed to be very foolish, like children when they write these things.
Let's even go one step further. I can bet you France was not mentioned anywhere in this article.
Oh, I think it was mentioned in a favorable light at some point.
Okay, here we go. So we've not heard France yet. This is the third page of 5 pages. Where? France. There is not there.
Okay, there you go. You just passed it.
Where?
Look at the last paragraph.
Okay, yes. Despite these fears, traditional ruler Oliguen Nguema had repeatedly affirmed he will stick to his mandate. With his assurances, he ensured Ghana suspended, which was restated French, with military honors.
Yeah.
Okay.
You see?
Okay.
Which confirms the purpose of this story, to sanitize the coup d'etat. And I would not be surprised if this man, entertained with military honors, come election time, is going to take off his uniform and resign from the armed forces and run for election himself and become a quote-unquote civilian president.
Democratically.
I think that's what they're already preparing for by inviting him to.
Democratically elected, of course.
Exactly.
So speaking of democratically elected heads of state, the Danish are not too particular about what is going on in the Sahel, and so they've opted out in a new African strategy. And this story comes from Radio France International. So Denmark's new African strategy sees the closure of embassies in Mali, Burkina Faso. Denmark said Monday it was shutting its embassy in Mali and Burkina Faso as part of its new Africa strategies, as military coups have severely limited the scope for action in the Sahel region. I don't know what action means. However, the Scandinavian countries said it will open embassies in Senegal, Tunisia, and Rwanda. Okay, interesting. Denmark has said it will bolster diplomatic staff at its embassies in Egypt, Kenya, South Africa, Nigeria, and Ghana. Following the closures in Bamako and Ouagadougou, a special representative will be appointed for the African Great Lakes and Sahel region, it said. Mali has turned to Russia and its Wagner mercenary group for support since military leaders seized power in 2020 and 2022, respectively. Mali's relation with European countries has deteriorated recently. Earlier this month, the military junta ordered the Swedish ambassador to leave the country after a Swedish minister criticized Mali's support for Russia. And this part. Danish Foreign Minister Lars Rasmussen said his country's reorganization of priorities in Africa came as Denmark and the European Union aim to be Africa's preferred partner as the continent faced whether to orient itself towards the east or the west. Before you go,
Yes.
could you tell the viewers what was the major reason for the 1955 Bandung Conference? Based on that last sentence there, as the continent faced whether to orient itself more towards the east or the west.
Right. Actually, yes, the Bandung Conference, of course, was following, World War II.
Yep.
When there was already, it became clear that the old empires had lost their power and would no longer be able to hold on to the territories that they formerly had colonized, including in Africa.
Yeah.
So the leading countries, including China, including India, including
Ghana.
Yugoslavia. Ghana sent a representative. I think it's somewhere, in some places it's misreported that Nkrumah also attended. I think he sent the foreign minister. So, of course, they were talking about what became later on actually the non-aligned movement. That the choice should not just be East versus West, led by the United States. And obviously, it was easier said than accomplished because they did not really give you that choice. And the main battleground, one of the earliest battlegrounds, was Congo, of course.
And still remains the battleground.
Remains the battleground today, where the Congolese, in fact, Patrice Lumumba, of course, initially, the first place he visited was the United States, trying to get assistance. And when it became clear he was not going to get it, then
pivoted.
He didn't even get a chance, really. He reached out to the Soviet Union, and they used that as an excuse to crush him.
Yeah.
That was 1960. Now, you're in 2024. Think about it.
that statement comes up
And
again.
this article is basically telling us that nothing has changed. Africa is still, like a game preserve where you go hunting for game, for animals. And the hunters, either now, of course, it's not the Soviet Union, now it's Russia, but pretty much the same geographical demarcations, right?
Yep.
Which was the case in 1960.
Mm.
So that is very telling that after all these years of so-called independence, Africa is not yet able to determine its own destiny. And any African who tries to become active in determining the destiny of his country, like Thomas Sankara, is eliminated. In the case of Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, they're isolated or they subjected to critical media.
Yep.
And that is what's going on in this article. And it's sad because countries like Denmark in the past, they had not been hostile toward African aspirations,
Yeah, supported
they
the
did not
liberation
go
movement. Yeah.
right hand lock and step with the United States. And that seems to be what this article is declaring, that this is what Danish officials are saying. And also, the most insulting part is when it talks about the aid than Denmark. Because first of all, it's a country, 6 million people.
Yeah.
So population-wise, very negligible, insignificant. But it does have financial resources. GDP almost over 400 billion. So compared to, a country like, Mali, which is under 20 billion, you can see it has possibilities of really assisting. But assisting, to me, can only come in one form, which is, of course, what was mentioned in the Financial Times article, to process the materials in Africa. In other words, to industrialize. And none of them are considering something that they are actually all talking about perpetuating dependency. And that is what they call aid. And in the case of Denmark, the aid itself is so negligible, I don't even know why they deserve a whole article such as this. I think it's less than $200 million. $200 million. LeBron James could cut that check. That's what Denmark is giving to the entire continent, right? LeBron James the other day cut a check for $40 million for scholarships. And Denmark is boasting that, I think,
for a population
this
of 1.3 billion.
It gave to Africa this year alone, as if it was so significant. I think it's something like $75 million. That's just mind-boggling. But at the same time, it shows how we are treated, you see? Unless you deserve to be respected, there's no reason why you should be respected. You earn it. China may be detested by the leadership in many Western countries.
Of course.
But China is respected. It is much more important to be respected and taken seriously when it comes to dealing with these Western countries than to be tolerated, condescending, paternalistic attitude.
I mean, it is paternalistic, like you said, that Denmark, of all the countries, all the Nordic countries, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden used to support all the liberation movements in the 70s and 80s. And now, Denmark is part of NATO, yes, and now start championing that same ideology.
Yeah. The same
Makes
narrative,
yes, makes grim reading.
When in fact, many of those countries were very proud of their independent policy
Yep,
when it came to dealing with the United States.
yep,
But
yep.
Africans do not deserve to have an independent policy.
Hmm.
It's just mind-boggling, but
Is it?
understandable. At the end of the day, even the so-called ones who are friends of Africa, at the end of the day, they're also imperialistic,
Hmm. Hmm. And it's not helped by the fact that the kind of leaders we have are not
Absolutely.
caught of the old club.
As I said, you will be respected when you deserve to be respected. If we don't respect them, it will not be surprising that Denmark and these other countries will not respect them too.
Well, speaking of respect, a debtor is not often respected. And so we go to the New York Times for our next, your paper of choice. We go to the New York
Yes.
Times for the next story, which reads, Africa's debt crisis has catastrophic implications for the world. The lead says crushing obligations to foreign creditors that have few precedents have sapped numerous African nations of growth and stoked instability. Written by Patricia Cohen. After a new tax increase incited weeks of deadly riots in Kenya earlier this summer, President William Ruto announced that he was reversing course. He abandoned the finance law he had proposed and then shook up his cabinet. Last week, the government reversed itself again. The newly appointed finance minister announced that some of those discarded tax increases would be reintroduced. The Ruto administration is desperately trying to raise revenue to pay off billions of dollars in public debt and avoid defaulting on its loans, even as critical public assistance and services are being cut. Governments throughout Africa are facing the same dilemma. The continent's foreign debt reached over 1.1 trillion at the end of last year. More than 24 countries have excessive debt or are at high risk of it, according to the African Development Bank Group, and roughly 900 million people live in countries that are spending more on interest payments than healthcare or education. Okay. Outside debt has a familiar problem in the developing world, but the current crisis is considered the worst yet because of the amount owed, as well as the huge increases in number and types of foreign creditors. And in Africa, a continent pulsating with potential and peril, debt overshadows nearly everything that happens.
Okay. So a number of points, and not too many. The article, this part you read, is wordy. It's overwordy for what it's for what it's trying to say.
Yeah.
Number one, and this is where we need to read very carefully as African people. The headline makes some reference to Africa's debt crisis. There's no crisis in Africa about the debt situation. There's a bigger crisis, and I'll tell you what that crisis is. And we've been talking about it all along so far. How do you determine what is a crisis? If I tell you that, okay, my brother, I'm not going to eat for 10 days,
Yeah,
or 2
that's
weeks.
worrying. That's worrying.
And
Question
then
would be why?
2 weeks you come and you say, oh, Milton has a crisis. First, how can I have a crisis when you knew that if I don't eat for 10 days or 2 weeks, something is going to happen, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how could that be a crisis when it was so predictable? So why do they always constantly keep referring to the debt crisis in Africa as if it's something that is happening for the first time? How can it still be a crisis when it's so predictable? It's built into the formula.
Yeah.
right? If I don't eat for 10 days, 2 weeks, I may die. Maybe it will take 3 weeks, but I'll die. It is so predictable that it should not be called a crisis. Milton wanted to commit suicide. He was determined to die, so he decided not to eat. You don't produce in Africa. You import. So how can you say it's a crisis when you borrow? If you don't produce and you're still importing, obviously the money must come from somewhere, right?
True.
It's so predictable that you're going to borrow the money from somewhere. And since we know you're not producing, isn't it obvious that you're not going to be able to pay? So tell me where the crisis is in this scenario. In other words, Africa is a living, walking, breathing crisis. That's what you're telling me. Or it's not a crisis because we know the outcome already. The crisis in every one of these African countries is a lack of the capacity to produce. It's like if you say each and every African country is not going to eat, each and every African country is going to die, just like I would die if I don't eat 2 weeks. So let's stop calling it crisis. Let's stop acting as if we are surprised. So the article says, what makes this one special and much more worrisome is the amount. As if it was half of the amount, then things would be somehow better. Yeah, right?
True.
What makes this one worrisome is that production is actually declining in many of these articles. There's a part where I think they say there was a lack of growth in GDP of over 1% or something. That is the lead of the article. That should be the story. As a result of Africa not eating, Africa is dying. As a result of Africa not able to produce, Africa is getting mounting debt and not able to pay for the debt. Instead, you make the debt the lead of the article as if it's a behavioral problem, right? Like some sort of African psychosis. They have a tendency of not knowing how to manage borrowing and paying. How can you manage it any better than you're managing it without changing one part of the equation, which is to produce more, right? And import less, because you're producing the things you're importing computers. Yes, of course, you want to be up with the technology. You don't want your citizens to be left behind. You are importing smartphones, which pretty much every African now has. You're importing pharmaceuticals because you're not exploring and exploiting the traditional medicines that your ancestors have perfected over centuries. They knew which plants cured what and what and what. See? And yet you're still importing these pharmaceuticals in nice packages and all that. You're even importing those earpods that your young people love. You can't produce that, in Africa. That is the story that they should be doing, but they won't do, because if they did that story, they would have to address many issues. Why is Africa not producing? Because the World Bank is saying, if we give you money for this, you cannot use it for industrialization, right?
No healthcare.
No healthcare. In fact, let's forget about industrialization. Let's start with the basic. You're right. Healthcare, education.
And you can't subsidize agriculture.
Subsidize transport, which we know, in fact, let me give you an example. That just hit me in a big way. As you know, I'm now attending Howard.
Okay.
And doing the PhD program in history.
Okay.
So I said, let me look at, in New York, I'm used to buying the Metro card, which allows me unlimited traveling for 1 week on the subway, on the bus, And here in New York, we complain because it's $32 per week. And I'm sure it's a lot more in the UK. In the UK, probably just 1 or 2 days you spend $32. This is 1 week. You can travel. If I wanted, I can travel 10 times today on the subway. Go one road, get out, get in again. All day, just travel. And the bus. And that card, 1 week. Many people think, okay, it's high. I went to Washington, so I said, let me compare. In Washington, it's $72. So then I realized how New York must be subsidizing it substantially. And yet, the World Bank or IMF would not allow any African country to do things like that. In Nigeria, and they rolling back the subsidy on fuel.
Yes, on fuel, yeah.
See, these are the kind of things. And these are the kind of things that would have to be discussed in the article. And then you would then say, as a result of all these
rollbacks,
conditions imposed on Africa's economies, and because they can't produce, therefore, this mounting debt. You can't just start with, oh, this is the debt in Africa, and then never tell us why. So the why, they said, is because now there are many sources of borrowing. Now China is a major player.
Yeah.
I think it gives a statistic saying China, for new debt in Kenya, China accounts for 73% for borrowing. In Uganda, 72%. I think in Nigeria or some other country was 80-something%. Right? That is the problem. And you know why they're doing that, right?
Yep.
Because they were happy when the source of borrowing was from the West.
Exactly.
IMF, World Bank, and private Western banks.
Paris Club,
Chase,
London Club,
Citibank, all these big Barclays, Standard Bank, because when you borrow, it means the lender is making money.
Hold
doing it out of the goodness of their heart.
Hold that thought. There is a part of that article that jumped out at me. And this was it. Bear me a second. It was something to do with a particular time in the last decade, which then, jumped out like, okay, so what are you telling on yourself? Let me see. Where is it? There is, let me see. Hold on. There is, if I am not mistaken, it was somewhere, it was something to do with, let me see. Okay. It was in my notes when I was reading it. That's where I made one quick one.
And in terms of what you mentioned already, that Kenya is reversing some of those rollbacks.
Yeah.
And it's not just Kenya waking up one day. Kenya is under tremendous pressure from the creditors
to live up to his responsibility. And
they're being told, how are you going to service the interest if you don't tax?
Yeah.
And there's no answer to that. So Kenya has no choice.
There is no amount of marching in the streets. You're going to have to pay this loan. This loan was taken out. And where is it? Let me see. Move by country to flight. Essentially, what that part was, it was following in 2010. What transpired in 2010? Loan sourcing was cheap. So they went out shopping to the African countries for them to take the loans.
Right.
What was funny about that timepiece was also that was the same time the US and the West have their financial crisis. So the money that was given to the banks was thrown towards those loans. Those loans essentially was a way of pulling in resources from the likes of Africa and Asia in order for them to balance the books. Once those books were paid off to the government, because you had to ask the question, how come they got all these loans and they were able to pay them back so quickly? only to now find that these loans are actually the private loans that are being given out to what's it called? They're given out to the African countries that they now want back. So it's not so much as a country loan, country to country, but it's actually just financial institutions like the likes of the Paris Club, the London Club, that are actually financing these loans. And sometimes some of these big banks are actually the faces of those loans.
No, they have no choice because that's how banks make money. People
Mm-hmm.
tend to forget
Yeah.
that banks have to lend
Yeah.
in order to make money. Number one. Number two, banks really don't want you to pay the loans back. Banks want you to service the interest.
Mm.
If the loans can be perpetual, that's exactly what banks want. I can't make money if I lend you money and then you pay me back next week. What is that? You know, I give you $100. Next week you say, you know what? I'm paying you. In fact, I'm giving you $150 back. That's nothing. I would rather you pay that 10% interest perpetually. So my $100,
We
in
just
the
keep
end,
waking up.
I get up getting $1,000
Thousand.
from you for my $100, or even $10,000. That's the situation that persists in many African countries. Why was Sankara killed? Sankara was killed for two reasons. And his suggestion, which of course they could not meet, was that if we can, let's go Washington to the World Bank and pay off all the money that we borrowed, that we owe. First of all, those institutions would not like that, because that would just kill their model of how to, as I said, banks make money by you serving the interest. And then number two, which was of course much more lethal and drastic, was the suggestion that we renounce the debt and collectively not pay. That cannot happen because you would collapse many banking institutions.
Yeah.
And obviously if you took that, first of all, if you take that position, you would be able to negotiate strong terms that would actually benefit you in the long run. So we started off with the article which said they should negotiate better conditions, have raw materials processed within their African countries. We started off with that article from I think it was Financial Times.
Financial Times, yeah.
Okay. Can you imagine the concessions? Now we are told that Africa, the total debt is $1.1 trillion. Mexico, in the 1970s, it was on the front page of all these newspapers and magazines like Newsweek, Time, when Mexico's debt reached $100 billion.
Wow.
Right? And guess what? Mexico used it to its advantage. Mexico said, because they came to Mexico and said, you know what, you guys, you have a problem. You owe us $100 billion. Then Mexico sort of scratched his head and said, you know what?
That's true.
You guys have a big problem. And they said to Mexico, what do you mean? He said, well, we can't pay this. We have to find a solution together. And the banks were like, what? And then they realized Mexico was correct. Now, which African leaders are going to be daring to say, you know what?
We have a problem.
We have a big problem. 1.1 trillion. What should we do? That's what they should say. What should we do about it? Not should I do about it. You see? And they'll listen to you. So listeners, if you don't see us on this show again, Adesoji is missing. Nobody knows where he is. I'm missing. My professors at Howard can't find me anywhere.
That's true.
My graduate assistantship teaching students can't find me anywhere.
Because it's funny that you should say that, and I think we'll round up with this. When you were talking
that's
about
what they should do. You know it, my brother.
Yes,
1.1 trillion is no longer a liability for the borrower. It's an asset.
Assets.
Come to the table and say, okay, this time, first of all, how much are you willing to write off, complete? Okay, thank you. Boom.
How much are you willing to reschedule?
Boom. And then number 3, how much of my plan for industrialization are you willing to support with new money so that in 5 years' time, this is my level of industrialization. You can't be a country and your level of industrialization is 1% or 2%. No, I want to be 20% by this year, 25% by this year, industrialized. You see, those are the things that African finance ministers need to be negotiating. And of course, they can only do that by getting authorization from their president. And sadly, it comes at a tremendous cost, as Thomas Sankara proved.
Even before Thomas Sankara, there was a gentleman who wrote a book
So
titled
read the back of there's a blurb in the back page, the back cover.
The essence of neocolonialism is that the state, which is subject in theory, independent and have the trappings of all international sovereignty, in reality, its economic system and thus its political policy is directed from the outside.
There's a part on the back of the cover. Flip the cover and look at the back.
This one?
Yes. What does it say?
This part?
No, the top part.
The top part. This is a book which, when published in 1965, caused such an uproar in the U.S. State Department that a sharp note of protest was sent to Kwame Nkrumah, and the $25 million of American aid to Ghana was promptly cancelled.
Think about that.
It exposes the working of international monopoly capitalism in Africa and shows how the stranglehold of foreign monopolies perpetuate the paradox of Africa poverty in the midst of plenty.
Isn't that what we are discussing in this New York Times article?
Yep.
And the solution is in that book that you are holding. And
Yep.
for that book, that was the beginning of the end
And for
from
Nkrumah.
The book
Yep.
was published in 1965. Not only did they cut that aid, which you're mentioning, which, by the way, in today's dollars would probably be close to 500 million. It's a lot of money. Maybe 300 and plus billion, right?
Yep.
And then, of course, the next year, he was overthrown. Coincidence? I doubt it. Yeah, so there's a price that comes with independence. Meaningless independence is fine, which is what many of these African countries have. Meaningless independence. So you have the, big tough men like Museveni killing civilians, locking them up and all that, calling himself president with the police and soldiers saluting to him, riding with this flag on his limousine and all these bodyguards. Nothing. It's nothing. He's running a country that is not independent. And multiply this for all those other leaders. It's only paper independent.
And
when you start asking for true independence, like as you showed Nkrumah, you're out of power.
Badu?
Lumumba, you lose your life.
Yeah.
Sankara, you lose your life.
Yeah.
Sankara said one thing, which is still the wisdom that all these, I'm sorry to say, useless leaders. They're useless because they're not serving the interests of our people. Sankara said, if we stand together, they cannot assassinate 54 African presidents. They just can't. That's true. But if I stand alone, I will not be here to attend next year's summit. 3 months later, his prediction
came true.
100% came true.
Came true.
So two wisdoms. Where is the wisdom by our former leaders? Nkrumah said, you must unite. Otherwise, they'll keep exploiting us. Sankara said, we must unite and stand together because that's the only way they cannot assassinate all of us. So they were saying the same thing in a different way, you see?
Wow. So, yes, we'll continue to do this. And if you want to support us, share, like, subscribe. You can also listen to the audio version of this podcast on all major podcast platforms. And again, we'll continue to say thank you to Comrade Allimadi for coming in and doing what you do.
Thank you.
Victory Aseta. And it is from Brother Milton. Any final thoughts?
See you next week, my people.
See you next week. And from me as well, it's see you next week, and have a lovely rest of the weekend. And until next week, it's goodbye for now.
That's a wrap for this week on the African News Review podcast. We hope you are leaving with a clearer, more truthful picture of Africa. Remember, every story has another side, and we're here to uncover it. Don't forget to join us next Sunday at 12 p.m. Eastern as we continue to challenge the narratives and reclaim Africa's voice. If you've enjoyed the show, be sure to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep seeing Africa for what it truly is.